It was a bright summer morning in the charming coastal town of Cedar Bay, where the salty breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. Among the tourists exploring the town's picturesque streets was a software engineer from Toronto who had chosen this quiet destination for his much-needed vacation after 3 years of non-stop work on a groundbreaking project. The visitor had spent his morning wandering through local art galleries and antique shops, taking photos of the historic lighthouse that stood proud against the crystal blue horizon. His stomach growling after hours of sightseeing, he spotted the Water's Edge Diner, a charming restaurant housed in a renovated Victorian building with a reputation for serving the best seafood chowder in the region. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The diner had that classic small-town charm: checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the kind of counter where regulars probably knew exactly which worn-down spots marked their favorite seats. Old fishing photographs and maritime memorabilia decorated the walls, telling stories of the town's rich history. The lunch rush was just beginning, and the buzz of conversation filled the air along with the clinking of cutlery and the sizzle of food on the grill. The aroma of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee created an inviting atmosphere that made the visitor feel right at home. He chose a cozy window booth where sunlight streamed in, warming the polished wooden table. A waitress who had been working at the diner for 15 years approached his table. Her name tag was slightly tarnished, and her apron showed the wear and tear of countless busy shifts. The visitor looked up with a friendly smile, ready to order the chowder he heard so much about. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "Could I see a menu, please?" What happened next felt like a scene from a different era, one that everyone hoped had been left in the past. The waitress's face twisted with an unexpected anger, her next words cutting through the diner's friendly atmosphere like a knife through butter. "We don't serve your kind here," she spat out, her voice trembling with venom. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you belong?" Time seemed to freeze. The clatter of dishes stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. The only sound was the quiet hiss of the grill in the kitchen and the muffled gasp of a young child at a nearby table, quickly shushed by their embarrassed parent. Other diners sat in stunned silence, some lowering their eyes to their plates, others staring open-mouthed at the scene unfolding before them. A few reached for their phones, their fingers hovering over their cameras, unsure whether to document what was happening or pretend it wasn't. The visitor sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the table. His expression shifted from shock to something more complex, a mixture of sadness, disappointment, and surprisingly, curiosity. He'd faced discrimination before, but there was something different about this moment, something that made him want to understand rather than react. The kitchen door swung open with a bang. The owner, a man with salt and pepper hair and wearing a flour-dusted apron, emerged just in time to hear the waitress's words. His face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, but instead of immediately firing her or causing a scene, he did something unexpected. "Both of you," he said firmly but quietly, "please come to my office." The other customers watched as the three figures walked toward the back of the diner, disappearing behind a door marked "Private." Nobody touched their food. Nobody left. They all sensed that what happened next would be something worth waiting for. Little did they know that this ugly moment would become the catalyst for a transformation that would ripple through their entire community, touching lives far beyond the walls of the Water's Edge Diner. Sometimes, the most powerful changes begin in the most unlikely places, sparked by the most painful moments. And on that sunny summer day in Cedar Bay, a new story was about to unfold, one that would challenge everyone's expectations about hatred, forgiveness, and the possibility of real change. The owner's office was smaller than a storage closet, with barely enough room for 3 people to stand comfortably. Old photographs of the diner from the 1950s covered one wall, while the other held framed newspaper clippings about the restaurant's famous chowder. A tired desk fan pushed around the warm air, doing little to ease the tension in the room. The visitor took a seat in one of 2 wooden chairs facing a cluttered desk, while the waitress remained standing, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her face had lost its anger, replaced by something that looked more like fear. The owner settled into his creaky office chair, running his hands through his hair as if trying to massage away a headache. Outside the office, the lunch crowd had grown unusually quiet. Everyone was straining to hear what was happening while pretending they weren't. A young couple who had been about to leave decided to order dessert instead, not wanting to miss whatever came next. "I've owned this diner for 27 years, the owner began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My father owned it before me, and his father before him. In all that time, nothing like this has ever happened here." He paused, looking at the waitress. "I should fire you right now. That's what everyone out there expects me to do." The waitress's shoulders slumped. Her hands, which had been balled into fists, now hung limply at her sides. A tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another. "But," the owner continued, turning to the visitor, "before I make any decisions, I'd like to understand what happened here. Both sides of it." The visitor nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like to understand too," he said quietly, surprising both the owner and the waitress. What happened next was even more unexpected. The waitress, who had been standing rigid with tension, suddenly collapsed into the empty chair. Her whole body seemed to cave in on itself as she began to speak. "My mother," she choked out between sobs, "she's dying. Cancer. The bills keep piling up and I just can't." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "I've worked here for 15 years, never took a vacation, never called in sick. This morning the hospital called. They're talking about stopping her treatment because we can't pay." The visitor leaned forward slightly, his face softening. The owner pulled a box of tissues from his desk drawer and placed it between them. "I've never left this town," the waitress continued. "Never had the chance. Mom raised me alone, working 2 jobs. Now I'm doing the same thing, working here and cleaning offices at night. When you walked in, looking so successful, so different from anyone I know, She shook her head, unable to continue. The visitor sat quietly for a moment, processing her words. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "I understand feeling trapped," he said. "I grew up in a small apartment above my parents' convenience store. We worked every day, 15 hours a day, just to keep food on the table. But that's not an excuse for hatred." The owner watched this exchange with growing interest. The atmosphere in the tiny office had shifted from tense to something else entirely. The visitor wasn't showing the anger everyone expected. Instead, he was listening, really listening, to someone who had just wounded him deeply. "What if," the visitor said slowly, as if the idea was just forming, "we could turn this moment into something different? Something that could help not just you, but others who might feel the same way you did." The waitress looked up, confusion mixing with the tears on her face. The owner leaned forward in his chair, his expression curious. Outside the office, the lunch crowd had grown. Word had spread quickly in the small town, and people were coming in just to see what would happen. Some were already taking sides, ready for conflict. None of them could have predicted what was about to unfold. The visitor reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card. "I'm not just a tourist," he explained. "I run a software company that specializes in educational programs. We create virtual reality experiences that help people understand different cultures and perspectives." He placed the card on the desk. "Maybe this is happening for a reason." The fan continued to whir in the background, but the air in the room felt different now. Something was shifting, like the moment when storm clouds begin to break and the first rays of sunlight peek through. No one in that small office knew it yet, but they were about to embark on a journey that would change not just their lives, but their entire community. The owner picked up the business card, studying it carefully. The waitress had stopped crying, her expression moving from despair to cautious curiosity. And the visitor, who had every right to walk away in anger, was instead opening a door to something none of them had imagined possible when they walked into that office just minutes ago. The rest of that afternoon at the Water's Edge Diner felt like watching a play where the script kept changing. The lunch crowd had thinned out, but those who remained sat in hushed anticipation, stealing glances at the owner's office door. When it finally opened, nobody was prepared for what happened next. The visitor emerged first, followed by the owner and the waitress. Instead of the expected scene of security escorting someone out or angry exchanges, they walked to the center of the diner together. The owner cleared his throat, and the quiet murmur of conversation died completely. "I want to share something with all of you," the owner announced, his voice carrying across the diner. "Today, we had a moment that could have torn this place apart. Instead, it's going to bring us together." He gestured to the visitor, who stepped forward. My company creates virtual reality programs that help people understand different cultures and ways of life, the visitor explained, his voice warm and engaging. We've mainly worked with big corporations, but today made me realize we've been thinking too small. The waitress, who had been staring at the floor, slowly raised her head. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else there now, a glimmer of hope, maybe even excitement. I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody looked exactly like me, she said, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger. I never had the chance to travel, to meet people from different backgrounds. I let my fears and frustrations turn into something ugly. But today, she paused, taking a deep breath. Today, I learned that sometimes the person you hurt the most can become your greatest teacher. An elderly man sitting at the counter, a regular who'd been coming to the diner for decades, raised his hand like a schoolboy. What exactly are you folks planning? The visitor smiled. We're going to turn this diner into more than just a place to eat. It's going to become a place where people can learn about each other's stories, cultures, and experiences. Using virtual reality technology, we can help people travel to places they've never been, understand lives different from their own. The owner pulled out a chair and stood on it, commanding everyone's attention. Starting next month, we're going to host weekly cultural education sessions right here in the diner. But we're doing more than that. We're creating a scholarship program for local students to travel and experience different cultures firsthand. The waitress stepped forward, her voice stronger now. And I'm going to be the first student. She turned to the visitor. If you'll let me. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed. People who had been sitting in awkward silence began to talk excitedly among themselves. A young teacher from the local high school approached the owner, already brainstorming ways to involve her students. An elderly couple offered to share stories about their travels across Asia. The visitor watched all of this unfold, a gentle smile playing on his lips. He caught the eye of a young child who had been watching everything with wide-eyed wonder. The child whispered something to his mother, who nodded and approached the group. My son wants to know if he can share his story too, she said. His dad is from Kenya, and his grandma is from Ireland. He says he's like a walking cultural education program. The laughter that followed was warm and genuine. As the afternoon wore on, the diner became a buzzing hub of ideas and possibilities. People who had come expecting to witness conflict found themselves part of something much more powerful, the birth of real change. The owner had disappeared into the kitchen, and now he returned with bowls of his famous chowder. Can't plan a revolution on an empty stomach, he announced, passing them around. The waitress, who just hours ago had been filled with hate, sat down next to the visitor. They began talking about the logistics of the program, about how to make it accessible to everyone in the community. Her notepad, usually filled with food orders, was now covered with ideas and plans. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Through the diner's windows, passers-by could see an unusual sight. People from all walks of life, huddled around tables, sharing stories and dreams. Some were crying, others laughing, but all were connected by something powerful that had grown from a moment of darkness. The visitor's phone buzzed with messages from his office, deadlines, meetings, urgent emails. But for the first time in years, those things could wait. Something more important was happening here, something that could reach far beyond this small coastal town. As evening approached, someone put on music, an old soul tune that filled the diner with its warm rhythm. The waitress looked around at the scene they had created and whispered, almost to herself, who would have thought that the worst mistake of my life would turn into something so beautiful? The visitor overheard her and smiled. Sometimes, he said softly, it's not about where we start, but how far we're willing to go to make things right. Word spread through Cedar Bay like wildfire. Within days, the story of what happened at the Water's Edge Diner had reached every corner of the small coastal town. But unlike most viral stories of racism and confrontation, this one was different. This one gave people hope. The visitor extended his stay at the local bed and breakfast, postponing his meetings and rearranging his schedule. There was important work to be done here, work that couldn't be rushed. Each morning, he'd arrive at the diner with his laptop, turning a corner booth into a temporary office. The waitress, determined to make amends, threw herself into learning everything she could. During her breaks, she'd sit with the visitor, poring over cultural education materials and sharing her own insights about the community's needs. Her hands, usually busy carrying plates, now took careful notes as they planned the program together. "You know what I realized?" she said one morning, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I've lived here my whole life, but I never really saw this place clearly until now." She gestured to the busy diner. "Look at everyone who comes through those doors. They all have stories we never bothered to hear." She was right. The diner had always been more than just a restaurant. It was where fishermen gathered before dawn, where teachers graded papers over endless cups of coffee, where tourists mixed with locals. Now it was becoming something even more special. The owner had cleared out an old storage room, transforming it into a small meeting space. He installed a projector screen and borrowed chairs from the community center. The walls, once bare, were now covered with maps and photographs contributed by customers, snapshots of their travels, their families, their histories. One afternoon, a group of high school students arrived with their technology teacher. They'd heard about the virtual reality program and wanted to help. The visitor watched in amazement as these teenagers, who everyone assumed were only interested in their phones, eagerly offered to teach older community members how to use the VR equipment. "We could create a local history project too," one student suggested, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Interview all the old-timers about how this place has changed. Maybe understanding our own story will help us understand others better." The waitress's mother, despite her illness, insisted on being part of it all. From her hospital bed, she helped coordinate with other patients and healthcare workers who wanted to share their experiences. The hospital's waiting room became an unexpected hub of cultural exchange, with doctors and patients from different backgrounds sharing stories between appointments. But not everyone in town was immediately on board. Some longtime customers stopped coming to the diner. Anonymous complaints appeared on local Facebook groups. The owner found a nasty note taped to the door one morning. Instead of getting discouraged, the waitress saw these reactions as proof of how much this work was needed. She started keeping a journal of her own transformation, documenting how her views were changing day by day. Her honest reflections about confronting her own prejudices became a powerful tool in reaching others who were resistant to change. The visitor's software company was catching the spirit too. His team began developing a special version of their cultural education program specifically for small towns and rural communities. They used Cedar Bay as their test case, incorporating real stories from the community into the virtual reality experiences. One rainy afternoon, they tested the first prototype. The diner was packed with people waiting their turn to try the VR headsets. The waitress went first, her hands trembling slightly as she put on the equipment. Through the virtual reality program, she found herself in a busy Toronto neighborhood, experiencing a day in the life of someone very different from herself. When she took off the headset, there were tears in her eyes. "I never understood," she said softly. "All these years, I never really understood." The visitor squeezed her shoulder gently, recognizing the genuine emotion in her voice. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the transformation happening at the diner. The headline read, "Local restaurant serves up more than just food, a recipe for change." The article caught the attention of media outlets in bigger cities, and soon reporters were calling the owner for interviews. But what really mattered weren't the headlines or the attention. It was the small moments of connection happening every day. Like when an elderly regular shared stories about his immigrant parents with a young family visiting from out of town, or when the high school students organized a multicultural food festival in the diner's parking lot. The waitress, who had once been the face of intolerance, was becoming known as the program's most passionate advocate. Her own journey from prejudice to understanding resonated with people in a way that polished presentations never could. "The hardest part," she told a group of community leaders who had come to learn about the program, "isn't admitting you were wrong. It's doing the work to make things right. But let me tell you something, it's worth every uncomfortable moment." As the visitor watched all of this unfold, he realized that his simple vacation had turned into something far more meaningful. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful changes start in the most unlikely places, sparked by the very things that could have torn us apart. 3 months into the cultural education program, the Water's Edge Diner had become unrecognizable, not in its physical appearance, but in its spirit. The same checkered floors and red vinyl booths remained, but the energy was completely different. The walls now featured a rotating gallery of photographs and stories from community members, each one revealing a unique piece of Cedar Bay's growing diversity. The waitress, who had once been at the center of controversy, was now leading morning discussion groups before her shift began. She'd start each session by sharing her own story of transformation, not hiding any of the uncomfortable parts. Her honesty drew people in, making them feel safe enough to examine their own prejudices. "I used to think change was impossible," she told a packed room one morning. "I thought people like me were stuck in their ways, but look at us now." She gestured to the diverse group gathered around the diner's tables, fishermen sitting next to college professors, teenagers sharing space with retirees, tourists mingling with locals. The visitors' virtual reality program had evolved too. Working with local high school students, they'd created experiences that went beyond just showing different cultures. They now included stories from Cedar Bay itself, the Portuguese fishermen who'd arrived generations ago, the Vietnamese family who opened the town's first international grocery store, the Native American history that predated the town's founding. One particularly powerful moment came when they tested a new VR scenario based on the waitress's own story. Users could experience both sides of that fateful day, feeling the sting of discrimination and understanding the fear and ignorance that fueled it. The program didn't excuse the behavior, but helped people understand how prejudices form and, more importantly, how they can be overcome. The owner had transformed his business model too. Every Thursday evening, the diner hosted community kitchen nights where locals from different backgrounds taught others how to cook their traditional dishes. The kitchen became a place of laughter, stories, and unexpected friendships. "Last week, I learned how to make authentic Chinese dumplings," the owner told the food critic who'd come to write about the changes. "But what I really learned was how food connects us all. When you're elbow deep in dumpling dough with someone, differences just melt away." The waitress's mother, watching all this from her hospital room, saw a remarkable change in her daughter. Despite her own health struggles, she found joy in hearing about each new development. The medical bills were still a challenge, but something unexpected had happened. The community had rallied around them. A local business owner, moved by the waitress's transformation, helped set up a fundraising campaign. Others joined in, organizing benefit dinners and charity auctions. It wasn't just about the money. It was about showing that when one person works to make things right, the community notices. The visitor, who now split his time between Toronto and Cedar Bay, watched all this with quiet satisfaction. His company had begun receiving requests from other small towns wanting to start similar programs. But he knew it wasn't just about the technology, it was about the human connections that made it work. One day, a young girl came into the diner with her parents. She looked around at all the photos and stories on the walls, then turned to the waitress with curious eyes. "Were you really the person from the story?" she asked. "The one who said those mean things?" The waitress knelt down to the girl's level. "Yes, I was," she said softly. "And that's why I work extra hard now, to make sure everyone feels welcome here. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can teach us the most important lessons." The diner's success began attracting attention from unexpected places. A major civil rights organization reached out, wanting to study how this small-town restaurant had created such effective change. Academic researchers arrived to document the program. But what impressed them most wasn't the technology or the formal programs, it was the authentic, day-to-day transformation they witnessed. "You can't hate someone whose story you know," the waitress often said during her discussion groups. "That's what I learned. When you really listen to someone's story, really listen, it changes something inside you." The visitors' company had started offering scholarships for local students to visit different countries and document their experiences. The waitress was scheduled to take her first trip abroad the following summer, a journey that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Late one evening, after most customers had left, the visitor found the waitress sitting at the counter, looking through a photo album someone had brought in. It was full of pictures from Cedar Bay's past: fishing boats, old storefronts, community celebrations. "You know what's amazing?" she said, not looking up. "All these photos show the same place, but I see it so differently now. It's like I was wearing blinders before, and now they're gone." She turned the page, revealing more snapshots of the town's history. I wonder what these same streets will look like in another 50 years, now that we're finally learning to see each other clearly. Outside, the last rays of sunset painted the sky in gentle pinks and purples. Through the diner's windows, the old lighthouse that had guided ships safely to shore for generations cast its steady beam across the water. Like that lighthouse, the Water's Edge Diner had become a different kind of beacon, one that guided people toward understanding, acceptance, and real, lasting change. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day at the Water's Edge Diner. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and sea salt as people gathered for what had become the town's most anticipated monthly event, Community Story Night. The diner looked magical in the evening light. String lights twinkled overhead, and candles flickered on each table. The usual clatter of plates had been replaced by the gentle hum of conversation as people found their seats, many holding notebooks or photos they planned to share. The waitress stood near the entrance, greeting everyone with a warmth that seemed to radiate from deep within. She'd recently returned from her first trip abroad, a 2-week cultural exchange program in Ghana. The experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering. "Before I tell you about my journey," she began, addressing the packed diner, "I want to share something I learned from a wise woman I met in a small village. She told me, when you point a finger at someone else, remember that 3 fingers point back at you. I used to think that meant something about blame, but now I understand it's about responsibility. Our responsibility to learn, to grow, and to help others do the same." She pulled out a small worn journal and opened it carefully. "This is the diary I started keeping the day everything changed in this diner. Would you mind if I read you something?" The crowd leaned forward, eager to listen. "Day 1, she read, her voice slightly shaky. "Today I showed the worst part of myself to a complete stranger, but instead of hatred, he showed me understanding. Instead of revenge, he offered opportunity. I don't deserve this chance, but I'm going to prove that people can change." The visitor, who had flown in specially for this event, sat quietly in the back. His company's virtual reality program had been successfully implemented in 12 other small towns across the country, but Cedar Bay remained special. This was where it all began. The waitress continued sharing stories from her journey, both her physical travels and her emotional ones. She talked about the friends she'd made in Ghana, the families who'd welcomed her into their homes, and how every meal shared was a lesson in humanity. "But you know what's funny?" she said, wiping away a tear. "I had to travel thousands of miles to understand something that was right here all along. Every person who walks through these doors has a story worth hearing, experiences worth sharing, and wisdom worth learning." The owner stepped forward, carrying a large framed photograph. It showed the diner's staff and regular customers, taken just that morning. Unlike the old photos on the walls, this one showed faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds, all smiling, all belonging. "This is who we are now," he said proudly, hanging the picture in a prominent spot. "But more importantly, this is who we always should have been." The high school students who had helped develop the virtual reality program presented their latest project, a documentary about Cedar Bay's transformation. They'd interviewed dozens of community members, capturing the ripple effects of what had started as a moment of hatred but had grown into a movement of understanding. One elderly gentleman, who had been coming to the diner for over 50 years, stood up shakily. "I've seen this town through good times and bad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've never been prouder of Cedar Bay than I am right now." The waitress's mother, whose health had improved enough to attend the event, beamed with pride from her wheelchair. The community support had helped cover her medical bills, and now she was helping coordinate the diner's outreach program from her home. As the evening progressed, more people shared their stories. A fisherman talked about learning to use social media from teenage volunteers, now using it to share his family's maritime history. A young teacher described how her students' test scores had improved since they started learning about different cultures, their curiosity sparked by the diner's programs. The visitor finally stood up to speak. "When I walked into this diner 6 months ago, I thought I was just getting lunch," he said with a gentle smile. "Instead, I found a community ready to prove that change is possible, that it's never too late to learn, and that the hardest conversations can lead to the most beautiful transformations." The waitress walked over and handed him a piece of paper. It was her resignation letter, not because she was leaving the diner, but because she was taking on a new role. The owner had created a position for her as the diner's community education director, focusing full-time on expanding their programs and helping other communities start similar initiatives. Sometimes, she told the crowd, our worst moments can lead us to our best selves, but we have to be brave enough to face them, honest enough to learn from them, and determined enough to change because of them. As the evening wound down, people lingered over coffee and dessert, sharing more stories, making plans for future events, and marveling at how far they'd come. The old lighthouse beam swept across the water outside, its light catching the sign in the diner's window, "Everyone's welcome here," and we mean everyone. The visitor checked his watch. His flight back to Toronto left early the next morning. But as he looked around at the scene before him, he knew that what had started here would continue growing long after he left. Real change, he had learned, wasn't about grand gestures or fancy technology. It was about people willing to open their hearts, share their stories, and believe in the possibility of transformation. 1 year had passed since that fateful summer day at the Water's Edge Diner. The small coastal town of Cedar Bay was preparing for its first ever Cultural Unity Festival, and at the center of it all was the diner that had become a symbol of transformation. The morning sun sparkled on the water as volunteers hung colorful banners along the street. The diner's parking lot had been transformed into a festival ground, with booths representing different cultures, stories, and traditions. The smell of foods from around the world filled the air, everything from Portuguese fish stew to Vietnamese pho, from Nigerian jollof rice to Italian pasta. The waitress, now the community education director, stood at the entrance of the diner, taking in the scene before her. She wore a beautiful traditional dress given to her by one of the families she'd stayed with in Ghana. Her mother, looking stronger than she had in months, sat nearby in her wheelchair, helping children make friendship bracelets. "You know what's amazing?" the waitress said to a group of visitors. "A year ago, I was the person who made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Today, people come from all over to learn how our little town changed itself. But the real story isn't about me. It's about how one moment of darkness led us toward the light." The visitor had returned for the festival, bringing his entire software company team with him. They'd set up a tech booth where people could try the latest version of their cultural education program. But the most popular feature wasn't the virtual reality headsets, it was the Story Corner, where locals shared their real experiences of change. The high school students who'd helped develop the program were now running workshops for other schools. They'd created a youth council that helped organize cultural exchange programs, connecting Cedar Bay's teenagers with young people from around the world through video calls and pen pal programs. Last week, I talked to a student in Kenya about fishing techniques. One young fisherman's son shared excitedly. "Turns out we use some of the same methods they've been using for generations. It's crazy how much we all have in common when we actually talk to each other." The diner itself had become something of a living museum. Photos and stories covered the walls, but they weren't just about the past anymore. They showed the community's journey, the hard conversations, the moments of understanding, the celebrations of difference. A special corner was dedicated to the Cedar Bay model, as other towns had started calling it, showing how similar programs were spreading across the country. The owner had expanded his business in an unexpected way. The Water's Edge Diner now offered consulting services to other restaurants wanting to become community education centers. "Food brings people together," he often said, "but stories keep them connected." Around noon, everyone gathered for the festival's main event. The waitress stood at a podium set up in front of the diner, facing a crowd that would have been unimaginable a year ago. People from neighboring towns, journalists, community leaders, and even a few documentary filmmakers had come to hear her speak. "When I look at all of you today," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I see more than just faces. I see stories. I see journeys. I see proof that change isn't just possible, it's natural when we open our hearts to it." She paused, looking at the visitor who had started it all. He sat in the front row, smiling encouragingly. "A year ago, I was filled with hatred born from ignorance. I said words that should never be said, caused pain that should never be caused. I could have lost everything that day, my job, my dignity, my future. Instead, I found something precious. the truth that it's never too late to learn, to grow, to become better. The crowd listened intently as she continued. But this isn't just my story. Look around you. See the fisherman teaching his traditional recipes to college students? Last year, he'd never left this town. Now he's planning to visit his online students in Japan. See that group of teenagers? They used to stick to their own circles. Now they're helping elderly neighbors learn about different cultures through technology. She gestured to the diner behind her. This place was always more than just a restaurant. It was where we shared meals, celebrated milestones, weathered storms together. Now it's also where we learn to see each other clearly, to hear each other's stories, to grow beyond our prejudices. The festival continued into the evening. As the sun set, people gathered for a candlelight ceremony. Each person held a candle, creating a sea of tiny lights in the growing darkness. The old lighthouse beam swept across the water, its steady light joining the hundreds of smaller flames. Each of these candles represents a story, the waitress said softly. A journey from darkness to light, a moment of change, a decision to be better. She lifted her own candle higher. And together, they show us something beautiful, that even the smallest light can help guide others toward understanding. The visitor stood up one last time to speak. A year ago, I walked into this diner as a stranger and found hatred. Today, I walk in as family and find love. That's not just change, that's transformation. And it happened because one person was brave enough to face her mistakes, one community was strong enough to choose understanding over anger, and everyone here was willing to believe that we can always become better than we are. As the festival wound down, people lingered in small groups, sharing stories and making plans for next year. The waitress's mother, tired but happy, watched her daughter moving through the crowd, stopping to hug old friends and welcome newcomers. You know what the best part is? The owner said, standing in the diner's doorway. This isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. He pointed to a new plaque mounted beside the door. It read, "Welcome to the Water's Edge Diner, where every meal comes with a side of understanding and everyone's story matters." The lighthouse beam swept across the water one more time, illuminating the faces of people who had come together to prove that change is possible, that understanding can grow from conflict, and that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest words. I'm ready to learn.